Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, February 20th edition of the Cluster API office hours. Um, Please go ahead and add your name to the agenda. And if you have any items that you want to bring up, please go ahead and add those as well. I went ahead and put a link in the chat for those who are attending live. Let's see. To start out with, we have Andrew wants to talk about a project, new project that he's working on.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. So yeah, the project I'm working on, it's a really ultra minimal Linux distribution that aims to just run Kubernetes. That's it. Tries to get rid of all of anything that is not required by the kubelet or containerd, it's thrown out. Long story short, it's built on top of kubeatom. So you simply provide via user data, kubeatom config, and Talos should just know what to do. There's some minor configuration that you need to do things like HA with it. But yeah, so one of the things that we really would like to do with it is try to figure out how to integrate this with Cluster API. It actually has a gRPC API, so I'm still digging into Cluster API. I don't know how it all works. So really this is just about introducing it and hopefully attending these meetings more and figuring out how we might dovetail in with the Cluster API.
All right, to give you a little bit of a heads up, right now, kind of cluster bootstrapping is very provider specific.
Okay.
So most of the integration that you would end up doing would have to be with each of the individual providers for the different clouds that you would want to be able to deploy on.
Okay.
Longer term, hopefully we'll be able to kind of make that more common and reusable between the providers, but that's the current state of the world today.
Okay.
Have you tried running Talos on the various different cloud providers? Does it work as you expect? Or is it more designed for like bare metal, or what's your use case you have in mind?
We want to shoot for a consistent experience regardless of where you're at. And to answer your question, we've actually had it running on AWS. A buddy of mine got it running in Google Compute. KVM, obviously, that's pretty straightforward. We're trying to get it anywhere that you can, all the major cloud providers, but we don't see anything really blocking us in a major way to get it on all of them. So far, we have it on, AWS and Google Compute. DigitalOcean, they don't allow floating IPs, which is for custom images. So that's sort of a blocker for us right now. But we're going to try and figure out a way to hopefully work around that.
And the other question I had sort of right off the bat, looking at your GitHub page, is that each node exposes an API.
Yeah.
How do you that sounds like that was your gRPC API.
Yes.
What sort of like auth and auth-z you guys provide on that API? It seems like it's pretty important.
Yeah, it is. It's mutual TLS, so it's just all PKI.
And where do those certs come from?
So you generate some, you provide it to a master, and then still working on sort of the bootstrapping portion for the worker nodes, but they basically have a simple username and password that gets generated. They submit a CSR request to one of the masters. They send back a certificate, and then now you can reach that node via the CLI.
Okay, so it sounds kind of similar to the way that we do bootstrapping in Kubernetes.
Very similar.
Okay.
I'm trying to keep as aligned with Kubernetes as possible. This is meant to be for Kubernetes, and that's it. So yeah, very similar.
Cool.
I guess one of the really cool things would be the cluster provider AWS or cluster provider GCP could have the responsibility of just basically selecting that image and passing in the username and password, and then your Talos master, whatever that is, would talk to the cluster API and figure out what configuration actually has to happen on the, like what version of kubelet to run, for example.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm hoping, is that right now it just depends on passing in user data from whatever cloud provider. But I'm hoping with something like the cluster API that actually your I forget what you guys call it, but your master cluster can actually be responsible for sending back and forth whatever Talos might need.
Yeah. Hey, sorry, this is Spencer. I'm working on this stuff too with Andrew. But yeah, I mean, the way I've been kind of thinking about it is having a Talos provider that kind of wraps the other cluster providers, right? So that as you define a Talos config or whatever in cluster API, then it basically spits out almost another, request to like AWS cluster provider or whatever without the user data baked in.
You mentioned having a master and then sort of workers in Talos. I don't see any like pictures on the GitHub page. Can you describe a little bit about the architecture?
Yeah, sorry, I missed the very first part of your question.
Oh, I'm curious. You said you had a master and workers, and I'm curious like how those work, how they relate to each other.
Master and workers are exactly what you would consider them. They are Kubernetes masters and workers. It's just that Kubernetes masters, in the case of Talos, have an extra responsibility in doing Talos specific things, trying to keep it as minimal as possible, but they're one and the same.
Okay, so when you say master worker, those are literally equivalent to Kubernetes ones. There's not like a separate Talos master that's different from a Kubernetes.
No, it's literally just kubeadm init with an init configuration. That's what distinguishes a master and a join configuration from a worker.
Okay, and you said there was a little bit of extra stuff on a Talos master. Are you guys using CRDs or API extension servers?
So we've kind of done something crazy, and we've actually removed all like host level access, no SSH, it's immutable. So we actually run a small sort of management daemon on every node. So you don't need to be on the host, and it exposes an API that's based on the principle of least privilege. I mean, in the Kubernetes world, you could delete a node and have it come back up. So we don't see too much having to be done with this API, but we run those on containerd. The reason being is because if there is something wrong with the kubelet and you can't talk to that node, or for whatever reason, our daemon that lives on every node is as simple as possible, so that we have basically try to keep it up at all times, given under any circumstances, and you always be able to reach it and reboot the node or something.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
Hey, Andrew, I want to point you at an issue that we have in Cluster API 723. It might be something that you might be interested in contributing to in the future.
Yeah.
Go ahead and take a look at it.
Sorry, you said 723?
Yeah.
I'll take a look.
Not much work has been done on it yet, because we're focused on E1 Alpha 1, but I'm sure that post March, there will be more effort on this.
Okay, great. I'll take a look now. Thank you.
All right.
I was going to ask, do we see Cluster API evolving in a way that something like Talos could be plugged in? And so, like, for example, today, AWS has code to create a bash script to call kubeadm, and GCP has code to create a bash script that calls kubeadm. Like, we could, if we centralize that code somehow, or that generation of the code, I'm not exactly sure like how similar they are, but if we centralize that code, then like Talos could plug in at that point and be able to like work in the various providers.
Right.
It might be overkill because, I mean, there are a number of providers, but there aren't thousands, right? There are probably 4 that cover 99% and 10 that cover 100, I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe 5 that cover 99, I don't know.
No, that would be nice to, provide a consistent experience.
Jason, is that something you see happening in Cluster API or?
I think potentially. I know we've talked about it at a high level before, but it just hasn't been a priority yet. There's already a lot of kind of duplication between the providers. The question that I have is like for the AWS provider, we're trying to avoid maintaining a persistent, the ability to continue to SSH into the hosts after creation. So one of the common ways that are shared between some of the other providers right now is to basically spin up the instances and then SSH into the hosts and perform a series of steps. And that's something that we've explicitly tried to avoid doing with the AWS provider, instead using Cloud Init. So, you know, I would like to see any kind of common type approach be able to handle, you know, both of those approaches instead of just one or the other.
And we've talked about replacing the SSH with a gRPC type API in the past, right? I mean, I think it feels like we're all converging on this idea of, I'm just looking to see if Mr. Node ADM is here. I do not see him, but yes, I think Platform 9 have this concept of Node ADM, which is sort of like an API for that script, which could then also be used for baking, like 723, like baking an image or stamping an image. All right.
On that note, we should probably go ahead and move on. Next item on the agenda is Nadir with Cluster API Manager versioning.
Yeah, hi. So we're looking to do a new release of the AWS provider. Right now we use Bazel to generate our manifests, and we take the Cluster API repo. We get a manifest for the Cluster API Manager with a tag set as latest, but we probably want to version that. So I've got a bunch of questions like, how do we version it? And then what would be the process by which we actually do this on a sort of regular basis? And I think Chuck's got some similar questions and a proposal for that covers some of this.
Yeah, mine is more about having a good experience using Cluster API and sort of what Kubernetes versions are supported across which versions of the providers. So it's similar, but not quite the same.
So I think Robert could probably provide more detail here, but I think the current use of the latest tag was related to that being the default for KubeBuilder.
Yeah, I know when I cut at least one of the recent releases, I sent a PR to set latest to an actual version number, cut the release from there, and then sent a PR to switch it back to latest. Maybe it would make more sense instead of latest to have it be like, you know, 0.5.0 - next or something, and then we bump it to 0.5.0 and then set it to 0.6.0 next or whatnot. But I think there are at least a couple of images that are tagged with a specific version that have been uploaded from the main repo. And that sort of follows what we do in upstream Kubernetes. When we're cutting images is cutting a release is sort of a three-step process where you submit a PR to set all the version numbers properly. You build from that PR so that all of the baked-in version numbers are set and the container images that are pushed have the right version. And then you submit a PR to bump it to the next one. So I sort of did the same thing at least one of the times that I cut a release, hopefully both times. But yeah, we should probably just change it from latest to sort of indicate what's coming next instead of just saying latest, because latest is pretty useless.
Yeah, I think we're actually consuming the latest tag right now in the AWS provider because we rebuild the common manifest from the vendor Cluster API repo.
Right. Yeah, and that's where right now it's unfortunate because you'd have to basically vendor exactly that PR that the release was cut from that is pointing to the release version of the images.
Right.
And maybe once we actually have, you know, the alpha release and an alpha 2 release, that's not a big deal. But certainly right now, as we're trying to iterate quickly, it's, you know, you can easily break yourself by pointing to the latest.
Yeah. And as for the versioning scheme, right now, the previous releases that have been released that weren't latest are semantic version. And I know from my perspective, I think it makes sense to stay with that because there's potential to iterate on those the actual controller releases much faster than the actual API versions. Did that cover your questions, Nadir?
Yeah, it's enough to go on for now. Before you figure something out.
All right. Chuck, do you want to take over with your version?
Yeah. Sure. So I have a document here that's sort of outlining one of the issues that I also linked to here, issue number 730, related to as we start moving forward with releasing and getting to a stable API, we're going to start encountering problems with support and people coming to talk to us about what versions of Cluster API, support what versions of Kubernetes. And if you need to join, SIG Cluster Lifecycle group. I linked to the group right after the document, so you can join that to have access to the document. And so the way that I approached this was sort of outlining different use cases for people who want to use Cluster API and sort of what questions they probably are going to ask when they try to use Cluster API with a couple of possible solutions to said problems. I think there's a good short-term and midterm solution here. Short-term, it seems like the goal would be to keep the providers versioning reasonably stable across providers, so that users who are coming to look at different providers can know, oh, this version of a provider supports these versions of Kubernetes, and I think a lot of that can be solved with documentation. But I think there's another bigger question here that can be answered, and we were sort of talking about that a little bit earlier. It was mentioned on when we were talking about joining the shared kubeadm code, because right now in at least cluster API provider AWS, we have embedded the kubeadm configuration types into our provider spec, and that sort of ties our provider version, that sort of ties our supported Kubernetes versions to the kubeadm types. So that means that since we're using the v1 beta 1 types of kubeadm, we can support we are guaranteed to support the following 2 versions of Kubernetes. And since and so that means that if you're using our current version of AWS, then our provider AWS, then we can install 113, 114, 115 when those versions of Kubernetes get released. It would be really nice to have that sort of support seen across all providers. And so this document here that you're welcome to read, comment or not, is just outlining sort of where those thoughts are coming from and how we can sort of mitigate that problem before it gets kind of out of hand.
So I think there might still be some permission issues on the document.
Oh, really? Okay, let me try again. I see a lot of people are on it. Is there a better group I can share this with?
Yeah, I was able to open it. I think if you share it with the SIG Cluster Lifecycle group and Kubernetes Dev, that's generally cover everybody. I think there are a lot of people that may not be in the SIG Cluster Lifecycle group, but hopefully everybody's in Kubernetes Dev.
Perfect. I'll do that just as quickly as possible.
All right. And are you good with just continuing that conversation asynchronously, Chuck?
Yeah, we can talk about that and comment on the issue if you have thoughts. I'll be thinking about it more and commenting as well. So either the document or the issue linked is fine with me.
All right. Thank you, Chuck. Next up is Vince with a PR for adding machine owner refs for machines to link with the cluster.
Yep. So this is a follow-up from the other PR where we are now using a label to link a machine to a specific cluster. And it's also optional, an optional label. If you don't want that link, so that will allow some providers to work without a cluster. This will set the owner ref, non-controller owner ref for foreground deletion. So it will delete the machines first and then delete the cluster afterwards. A follow-up PR, and I have also an issue for it, is to also set the owner ref for machine deployment and machine set based on the same label. That's all I have.
This looks awesome. I have a follow-up question, which is, could we use this to replace the label if the owner ref was set?
So we're actually using the label. Well, we could expose, I guess we could expose like the owner ref and like make the providers do it.
I mean, I guess I'm saying, like, if I create a machine deployment today and set the owner ref to the cluster, do I then also have to set the label to say the cluster name?
You only have to set the label actually, and not the owner ref.
Or what if I wanted to set the owner ref?
That will kind of replace it, I guess.
So the one issue I would see there is if you're using the cluster cuddle workflow, wouldn't it be difficult to set the owner ref before the owner actually finishes?
Yeah, also I think we had some, I think just you brought up some issues doing pivoting, right? Which this wouldn't have, because the owner ref will be set by the controller. This is also in line from what we discussed with the proposal that Robert and I put out, like kind of forward looking, but that's kind of where we were going for, that like the controller loop, the reconcile will actually set the owner ref as needed.
So one question I have is, like, currently when you use machine sets, for example, the machines, I think the owner ref for the machines are set to the machine set. Is that correct? Wouldn't this then kind of conflict with, so are we going with the owner to be the cluster reference, or what? I mean, wouldn't this kind of conflict with it?
Could you repeat that a little bit?
So my understanding is, if you today, for example, when you use the machine sets, then the machine objects that gets created, and I could be wrong on this, but I think my understanding is that the owner reference for those machines will be set to the machine sets.
Oh, yes. So the DPR actually looks for objects that don't have owner references yet. So machines only will set the owner ref if they don't have already an owner reference, which the machine set will set.
Okay.
Then as a follow-up, we'll be able to set the owner ref on the machine set and the machine deployment only if the owner ref is not set, which will kind of close up the loop on how do we do cascade deletion.
Okay, so then it seems like, depending on how you created those machine objects, your owner ref could either be a cluster object or it could be a machine set object.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
You can have multiple owner refs, I believe, right?
Yes, although we don't want to get into a situation where, I guess, undefined behavior.
Yes, it's certainly more complicated. I agree with that, sure.
Yeah.
Just wanted to, you are allowed multiple owner refs. I just wanted to ensure that was, yeah.
Although in that case, in the machine set deployment, I think like that would be a controller owner ref. Is that correct? I think so. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think sticking with the single owner ref is probably safer. That way, if you start triggering the cascade deletion on a cluster, you don't end up with like battling potentially a machine set controller as you're deleting objects. Anyway.
But just so we would expect this not to be set for machines that are using a machine deployment, and so for most cases, this owner ref would actually not be set. Is that right?
So for a machine deployment, the owner ref would already be set on the machine to the machine set that is owned by the machine deployment.
And so it would not be set here.
Yep.
Yep.
This is for standalone machines.
Yeah, but there's going to be a follow-up PR for machine set and deployments to tie them up with cluster. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just wondering. So I hope I understood the proposal. So, but is there a possibility of racing in between? For example, if by any chance some machine object exists which is yet to be adopted by the machine deployment, but that's adopted by cluster first, or something like that? Is there just thinking out loud?
So I'm not sure, and that will need to be tested in the next PR. This will only be for single machines at this point, which is like the most simple case, right? The next PR, which will like pretty much extend the owner ref for machine set and deployments to the cluster, that I will need to run some tests to make sure that like there's no like race condition between setting the machines or not.
Okay. And the owner reference will, so who should set this owner reference? It should be set by the top level controller, which is the cluster, which will be the cluster controller, right? Because if the machine controller decides to do that, then there is a dependency that with the existence of the machine, there should also be the existence of the actual cluster, which we discussed some time back, that we might want to keep both of the things independent of each other. That there are machine API controllers, but there might not be cluster API corresponding cluster API controllers. So I hope I understood the proposal, but I have just a couple of doubts and trying to think out loud whether it makes sense.
So at this point, is the machine controller will set the owner ref, and it only sets it if there is a cluster with that name specified in the label. Which assumes that you also have a controller from a provider perspective.
Okay, but then there is a possibility that there is no cluster object, right? For example, I'm running my machine API controllers against GKE clusters. Just simple as that. Okay.
Yeah, that is a supported behavior. If you don't have a cluster, the owner ref won't be set.
Did you have a question, Pablo? I see your hand raised in Zoom.
Yeah, but basically, yes. At the point I was just want to say that I agree that you shouldn't assume that there is a cluster, because there are many use cases. I'm particularly interested in a use case where it's not guaranteed there is a cluster there. So it's important not to. That's the idea. Just looking at if there is no cluster, I don't know, truly convinced. I need to take a closer look at the PR, but it's a good point.
Yeah, no, if there's no cluster, we won't set the owner ref. So we make no assumption if the cluster is there or not. It's completely optional.
So
I've seen.
Go ahead, Harvey.
No, sorry. So as a pattern, what I have seen is that generally machine deployment creates the machine set, and then machine set creates the machine, right? So the machine set, let's say, creates the machine and says, create machine with following owner reference, right? So machine set decides that I'm creating 5 machines and I'm putting the owner reference on them. So if I mean, having this feature probably would be helpful to avoid the orphan machines in future, but if it is enforced from the top level controller to the bottom, probably it will be more guaranteed that that higher level controllers exist, and that's why someone at the lower level is being adopted, right? Otherwise,
yeah, I'm not sure if I'm following what are you proposing?
So from the cluster API controllers, from that level itself, we could decide that if a certain machine exists which does not have the owner reference, then I can probably adopt it and put the owner reference there. Other than machine controller decides that the higher level machine cluster object exists or does not exist. Just because I have seen this pattern in replica set and pods, where replica set creates the pods and then put the owner reference, and so the controller above decides whether I should adopt or not.
Got it. Yeah, I'll make sure to check that during the testing, so that that's clear, and maybe we can open an issue to track this out.
But if I follow, the idea is not only to check that this doesn't happen, but it's more like shifting the responsibilities. Like the machine doesn't have to know in which case it was created. So, but the one who created it knows. So it's like, shifting the responsibility to setting that to the one who really knows what's happening. If I follow the idea, I think that is.
So that's a little different because here we're only talking about a single machine item that or like resource that you're creating. For machine set deployment, that's kind of different because you have the two controllers that we support in Cluster API that create these resources, and they set the owner ref for you. Now, like that's gonna I need to check if like the owner ref is set before or afterwards. I'm quite sure that it's actually set before creating the whole machine. So like the spec will already have the owner ref in it, but I will double check it. But for the single item machine, where you can set a label, it will tie up to the cluster, and the machine controller will try to look for a cluster and set the owner ref for itself.
So, and the difference with trying to link the machine to a controller for this case too, is that the cluster objects don't actually create machines. The machines are created independently. And the way that we're linking those machines back to a specific cluster is through a label that we're setting on the machines.
Yep.
And similarly with machine sets and machine deployments, to link those to a specific cluster, those would also have to be linked through a label as well.
I think David unmuted before. I don't know if you wanted to say something.
I just was going to comment that this morning I reviewed the PR. I'm really excited about it because we like this behavior internally at Samsung where you could delete the cluster and have it automatically delete the machines. I just wondered, since it's optional, how do we document this? The current documentation is intended for provider implementers.
That's a very good question. So as Justin pointed out, I see like some providers like using mostly like a machine deployments and machine set. The AWS provider, as of this point, we actually lean towards like a single item machine, but we might move to deployments very soon there too. I would expect it's the provider responsibility to provide enough documentation on what happens like when you trigger a delete. There is going to be fragmentation, but that's because we don't have the cluster resource as mandatory, and we make it optional. So that behavior is going to change between providers necessarily.
Right. So for provider implementer documentation, so my comment was just suggesting that we document this as part of the cluster controller because that's where the user-facing semantics have the most value. But from a provider implementer standpoint, this is actually a machine actuator change, and that's where it should be documented. So I don't know. I guess my comment is just that I think we should document this. It sounds like because of where it's implemented, it should be documented as part of the machine actuator. And then I will just say that I personally look forward to a day when I can tell people that deleting the cluster will actually clean up all the resources reliably for a majority of use cases.
Yeah. I can follow up in Gitbook for a PR that kind of clarifies like what happens when you have a cluster label set for deletion. Oh, I can just put it in here.
Any other questions, comments, or concerns about that topic? All right. Next up, Eric Staples with delete policies.
Yeah, hello. So I opened up a PR a couple weeks ago, I think, and it introduces two new delete policies. It introduces the newest delete policy and the oldest delete policy. As part of the feedback, it was suggested that along with the annotation, we should also add the unhealthy check. So basically the heuristic is delete machines that have a specific annotation, and give the next priority would be to delete unhealthy machines. And then the following priority would be, newest or oldest, depending on which policy you choose. So that's a similar heuristic as what is in the simple delete policy. So that basically makes the simple delete policy somewhat useless. And so I wanted to bring up the idea of removing the simple delete policy in favor of the oldest and newest.
And just to clarify, the simple delete policy just kind of took a machine at random and deleted it.
That's
correct?
right. That's right, yeah.
Does anybody have any objections with removing simple or?
Okay, but simple delete policy or whatever is the default delete policy, that will anyway choose the unhealthy machines first, right? So that behavior will then be incorporated in other policies, or because
Yeah.
that is probably so the
Yeah,
newest and oldest. Okay,
that
sorry.
behavior will be implemented in the oldest and newest policy as well. So, first off, delete the annotated machines, and then delete the unhealthy machines, and then delete the oldest or newest, depending on which one you choose.
Okay. But then technically isn't the oldest or newest, right? So just wondering. So if a user is explicitly saying that I need to delete the newest set of machines, then out of 10 machines, let's say 3 of the machines for some reason are in unknown state, or which probably in future we can categorize as an unhealthy state, and user might actually want to delete the actual new machine, right? So
Well, the way that I was looking at it, because I was the one who I think stirred up this little bit of controversy. It was, if we have like the autoscaler coming in and annotating a direct machine to delete, I can't think of a case where we would want to not respect that. And also in the case of, the unhealthy machines, why would you delete a healthy machine just because it's the newest rather than the unhealthy machine? That seems like you would potentially actually compromise your resource availability by doing that. So that was kind of my rationale. There isn't a case that I could have thought of that you wouldn't want to delete an actual pre-selected machine or an unhealthy machine before applying the policy.
I think that makes perfect sense. So why would someone be not willing to delete the unhealthy machine? But that brings the question that how do we actually define the unhealthy machines here? So for example, from the health strategy wise, if we say that if the disk pressure is high for the machine, if the machine, and let's say if we decide on a health strategy where we say if disk pressure is high, and if it is high from last 30 minutes, then I would replace this machine, right? And should we, for those 30 minutes when the disk pressure was high, we consider that machine as unhealthy, or should we consider the machine as unhealthy only when the kubelet is not responding from so even for kubelet, the same situation can be implemented in a way that it's 10 minutes, I will replace the machine, but during the 10 minutes, we consider the machine as unhealthy. And it is probably be possible that maybe Kubernetes is not responding for a few seconds, but it will respond again. So maybe for very small duration, machine became unhealthy, but it will come up again in short time. Or
that's pretty easy actually, because we have the node web on the machine, and via the node web you can traverse to the node, and the node has a ready condition, and that is ensured by the kubelet. So I think we should just use that there, and that's in fact what the machine deployment controller currently use to update their status.
okay, so I mean that should be fine. Just asking that if the machine if the kubelet stops responding only for a few seconds, and probably it's a situation where it will probably come back in next 1 minute or and delete it in favor of the newest or delete policies, right? And that should be fine. Just I'm just trying to understand the situation. But in any case, I was willing at least a behavior where in certain machines getting certain keyword annotation should be given the highest priority, which can then be consumed by the outside tool like the autoscaler, where the purpose will definitely be served.
I mean,
yeah, right now.
Sorry.
Right now, it's looking at just the machine status to determine whether or not the machine is unhealthy.
I was just going to say one reason to keep the simple strategy might be that we do expect that simple might be kept when you're running autoscaler, and might be sort of perfectly reasonable. So it communicates that like a random strategy is actually fine, because we normally expect nodes to be deleted because they have the delete me annotation, equals yes annotation, which I love. Whoever named that gets a prize.
That would be Nate, who's also on this call. That actually makes a lot of sense to me. You know, I don't think 3 options is too many options, and you know, it doesn't hurt to give users that option to choose a random delete policy.
In that case, should we actually rename simple to random to make it more clear that that's what it's doing?
Or naive.
I like that idea. So there's.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I have 2 other bullets on here I wanted to bring up. The first is, well, the simple was the default delete policy before. So if we removed simple, we'd have to choose a new default. But if we do keep simple and just rename it, then it may just be as good a default policy as simple. We could keep it as, you know, naive or random or whatever we decide on. And lastly, there's a lot of discussion around atomicity, and I don't have any good solutions for atomicity. It seems like a good place to bring up that discussion is in this meeting. So I wondered if we can hash this out.
Yes, so I would also agree. I don't know a good solution to the atomicity at all, and because this was a very well discussed topic actually, and there was also a reason why it is pending for so long, that we actually had a separate discussion as well with the autoscaler community, where Ashik Patel and few folks from the autoscaler community joined, and they had concerns that if you don't maintain the atomicity in the solution, then there could be cases where autoscaler will behave strange. Don't expect the perfect behavior from the autoscaler. And but then on our side, we also know there is no as such good solution. But what I can remember, if I'm not wrong, is Mysum was probably working on, was trying to figure out a good solution out of it. And what we can do is that at least maybe in the upcoming week, we can try to align with them. We can try to set up a separate meeting again with the autoscaler community if possible, and just cross-check whether the solution really satisfies their need, and putting up our concern that we don't know a good solution, how to achieve the atomicity here, and because they have some ideas which could at least be slightly better, but not the perfect solution in that case. Just wondering if there is a possibility.
Yeah, I'd be open to having a meeting. You know, I might ask your help to help me set that up, because I'm relatively new to the SIGs, and I'm not too familiar with how to do these things.
I'll ping a couple of folks from the last time, or maybe Robert or someone is around your context. You can also do.
I have a bad solution for atomicity, and I really don't like it, and I think it introduces more problems than it solves. I don't even want to talk about it.
Nate is he's the co-author of this PR. So how about moving forward, we set up a meeting with the cluster autoscaler group and see if we can come to some consensus around what to do with the atomicity question.
That sounds good. Are you good with following up with that, Eric, or do we need to find somebody else to take that action item to set that up?
I can follow it up. I will have questions on how to do that, but I can ping others in the room to give me some guidance. I think Hardik will probably be going to you for that.
Yeah, we'll figure out. We'll probably ping a couple of guys from there who were interested last.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. On that note, next topic is mine. This is a follow-up from last week. We had talked about moving the Gitbook over to using Firebase, and I saw, David, the last update to the docs PR you had kind of assumed that. So I just wanted to check between you and Justin if there's been any additional progress or details about getting a Firebase account set up.
So there was a meeting this morning with the Kubernetes Infrastructure Working Group. Justin added this item to the agenda, so thank you very much, Justin. There's tentative agreement that we can get a Firebase account, and the action item is for me to work with DIMS to submit a request to the Google Service Desk in order to get that account. What that will mean in short term is that there will be credentials, and pushing will initially be manual. But I think we can go ahead. We could probably go ahead and automate. We could probably add an update to the Gitbook to the CI process shortly after we gain confidence that this actually works reliably. And then a last note on that, I think Firebase is really good because it keeps us in line with what KubeBuilder does. And then I think longer term, since the core Kubernetes documentation uses Netlify, it might be interesting to migrate KubeBuilder as well as Cluster API and anything else built using KubeBuilder to use Netlify. So yeah, I think we have a way forward now to use Firebase, and we should be able to wrap it up within the next week or so. And then longer term, I think we should migrate to something that is supported or supportable for arbitrary operators and not just Cluster API, because this is a generic problem.
Thanks for the update. All right, looks like the current last item on the agenda is about a container registry for integration tests in CI.
Yes, while working on this integration test for the main Cluster API, we need the container registry to start the Cluster API controller manager and also the example provider controller manager. I brought up this question in today's CADS infra meeting, and the guidance I got there is if it's only for testing, they're not going to fund this, and if it's for release for users, then it can be covered there. So the other suggestion I'm getting is to use a kind has a feature side loader. I chatted with Ben there, and looks like it's going to fit our needs. So I will work on that to try it out, and if it works, then this problem is going to be solved. So I just want to bring up here and see if anyone has other suggestion or opinion on this.
I have been testing. Remember your PR, and actually I was using the kind side load. It works like a charm. I mean, it's boom.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the best PR in the last weeks for kind because it addressed this problem. And you are doing development, you need to push that. It's one single command and we're done. So I will say that always, unless you have any other technical limitation on the CI environment, that's the way to go.
Cool. So it sounds like it should work. Then I'll just update the PR to include the include the kind side loader. Thanks, Pablo.
All right, thank you. Next, it looks like we got a new agenda item for an update on IPAM.
Yeah, I just wanted to a couple of meetings ago, I mentioned I was going to put together put an issue out there. What I've done is I've started to put together a proposal. I'm working with somebody here on it. And once I'm just doing it as a Google Doc, then I'll put an issue in for everybody to review. And if we like it, then I'll turn it into a CAP. I just wanted to make sure you knew I hadn't forgotten and everybody was aware it was still in progress.
That sounds good. When you get a chance, can you go ahead and link that doc in the meeting notes?
Sure.
All right. Any other topics before we wrap up for the day?
Okay, so we have 5 minutes remaining. Probably I can also add something quick. So it's basically a proposal which we sometime back discussed. I'll update that in the docs later, but it's basically a proposal for the machine actuator. The way we are doing the machine actuator and way it could be done, it's more of a long term. And I was recently thinking about it, and tried to put up some thoughts in the doc. It's about having the machine actuator implemented in a slightly different way, where we don't expect user to write the complete machine controllers and don't expect user to really know details of the integrities of how cluster API or the machine API stack really works. We expect user to only implement certain API, maybe a gRPC API, which I have proposed in the doc, where we give a user a brief small repository, a template repository, where we could create machine, delete machine, and get machine methods, and these other things can be then taken care by the shared machine controller, where we basically share the 100% of the machine controller at one place, which will be the cluster API project itself. And try to put some pointer there where and what, how it can actually be helpful in terms of adoption, where I was checking with folks from the CSI model, and they also believe that it helps in adoption in a way that the knowledge that you should expect from the user should be minimal when you are implementing the extension points. And here the knowledge is minimal. If you check the proposal, it's basically implementing a simple gRPC server which does not require Kubernetes knowledge or even the cluster API or machine API knowledge as such. And yeah, the vendoring issues, I was pondering upon that recently, that we are vendoring the entire cluster API project as such inside the controllers, and if there could be a good way that we can somehow decouple these two projects in a way that the APIs can evolve on one hand, and on the other hand, the drivers does not really necessarily have to be worrying about compatibility, and that could somehow be solved if we can make use of the provider spec blob that we are using, where it's anyway a blob, and if that blob becomes the main piece of the communication between controller and such out of tree drivers, then you can actually decouple that vendoring part at some level. So maybe you can, whenever you get a time, you can probably put some feedback there and see whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I think this dovetails into some of the other proposals that have been brought up as well. There's probably some overlap with the proposal from Robert and Vince for how do we kind of modify the types post v1 alpha 1. There's probably some overlap with the doc that Ilya started as well. And I know David, Daniel, and myself have been working out kind of a model for a webhook, a similar type approach, but webhook based as well. So I think it's good to get the doc started and out there, but I think it's best to kind of hold off discussion on kind of path forward until after we cut V1 Alpha 1.
I think I would completely agree on that. For V1 Alpha 1, it's too much to do, I would say. It's just that if we agree that something like this could be useful, maybe we can in parallel have thoughts on it.
Yes, actually, it's funny because the other day I was talking to Ben on the kind machine provider for cluster API, something I have commented, and because of some technical question that I have to how to implement it, I actually came to the same design pattern. So I will follow your design because I need the cluster that is running inside kind the cluster told to the kind which is running outside. So I need some way to communicate to the outside world. So at the end of the day, it's something very similar. I need the actuator to run on an external process, and the cluster call it, the actuator, the controller call the actuator using probably the same model. So I will probably try your proposal and see if it works and give you feedback. It's an entirely different use case, but I came to the same problem just for another reason.
So from the architecture wise, I tried to learn more or less completely from the CSI actually, that what they have done with the separating out the spec and so on. And I like the idea overall. So let's see.
All right, and at that, we're at time. So thank you, everybody, and hope you have a great day.